All right, so imagine a scenario that just feels, well, fundamentally wrong. You've got a really serious crime, one involving a child.
Yeah.
There's a conviction for that crime. It's even upheld by the highest court in the land. All the facts are clear, pointing right at the perpetrator's guilt under a law made specifically to protect kids.
Mm-hmm.
And then nothing. No jail time. The person walks free.
It just doesn't compute, does it?
Exactly. It's counterintuitive, right? It makes you just stop and think, wait, how is that even possible? That's precisely what we're going to dig into today in this deep dive.
Uh-huh.
We're looking at this specific case, a Supreme Court ruling from 2025 out of West Bengal that has really shaken things up and sparked a massive debate.
And the core of that paradox, the puzzle we need to sort of unpack here,
Yep.
is exactly what you laid out. The court acknowledged the crime, a terrible crime against a child.
All right.
They upheld the conviction under the POCSO Act. That's the Protection of Children from Sexual Offenses Act. But then, and this is the kicker, they decided against incarceration.
Against jail time.
Yeah. And the stated reason. It boiled down to the, let's say, unique and frankly really complicated family situation that had developed between the victim and the perpetrator after the initial crime.
It's just, wow, a situation dripping with complexity and, frankly, some really difficult questions. So our mission here is to guide you through this ruling. We'll break down the facts of the case, how it all unfolded, understand the specific legal tool the court used and why they used it this way.
Yeah, the rationale behind it.
Exactly, and really grapple with why this decision is causing such a stir. Because this isn't just about abstract legal stuff, It forces us to confront this messy intersection of justice, child protection, and, well, the often brutal realities of life.
It really does.
Okay, so let's start by grounding ourselves in the facts. What actually happened here? We need to go back to West Bengal in 2018.
Right, and the facts are grim. A 14-year-old girl was kidnapped.
Kidnapped.
The perpetrator was a 25-year-old man.
Right.
And the crime, the central crime, was rape. It's a horrifying starting point, no question.
Absolutely horrifying.
Right. And this is where the timeline gets crucial and brings in all that complexity that seemed to weigh so heavily on the court later on as the legal process sort of wound its way through the system, years past.
Okay.
By the time this case actually reached the Supreme Court, which was in 2025, the victim and the perpetrator, well, they weren't just two separate people involved in a court case anymore. They were married.
Married. Right. That's the detail that changes everything, doesn't it?
It seems to be the pivotal point. And not only were they married by 2025, but they also had a child together.
A child, too. Okay.
Exactly. So when the Supreme Court reviewed this whole thing in 2025, they weren't just looking at the 2018 crime in isolation. They saw the original crime, which was undeniable, and he was convicted under the POCSO Act.
They acknowledged that.
They did. And crucially, they upheld that conviction. Let's be really clear on that. They didn't acquit him. They didn't say the crime didn't happen or that the POCSO conviction was wrong.
So they basically said, yes, the crime happened. Yes, this conviction under this very specific child protection law stands.
Precisely. But then came the decision that's just ignited this firestorm.
Yeah.
Despite upholding the conviction, a serious conviction, the court decided against sending the man to prison.
Wow.
And their rationale, like we mentioned, it seemed to center entirely on the victim's current situation. They concluded that putting him in jail would actually make the victim, who was now his wife and the mother of his child, the worst sufferer.
The worst sufferer. Okay, so how did they even arrive at that? Especially when the crime is so severe and the conviction under a strict law like POCSO is still standing. They must have used some specific legal mechanism, right? They didn't just wing it.
No, they didn't wing it. They invoked a specific power, Article 142 of the Constitution.
Article 142, what is that exactly?
So Article 142 is, well, it's a really unique and pretty broad power that only the Supreme Court of India has. It essentially allows them to pass any decree or order necessary for doing complete justice in any case that comes before them.
Complete justice.
Yeah, think of it like maybe a constitutional safety valve. A power to ensure fairness and equity, especially when applying existing laws rigidly, might actually lead to an unjust outcome. It gives them significant leeway to step outside the usual rules, maybe even override procedural stuff to achieve what they deem is just in that specific situation.
Complete justice. That sounds incredibly powerful, almost like a blank check for fairness in a way. So the court's interpretation of complete justice in this case was essentially sending this convicted man to jail would actually harm the victim more because she's now dependent on him, married with his child.
That really seems to be the heart of their reasoning, yes. They appear to have prioritized preserving the existing structure,
Yeah.
this family vibe that had formed over everything else.
Yeah.
They seem to believe that the victim's dependence on the perpetrator meant that disrupting that situation, even through warranted punishment for a crime he definitely committed, would ultimately be more detrimental to her. The focus shifted. It went from the crime itself and accountability for it to the perceived stability of the situation after the crime.
And that just, it hits you immediately, doesn't it? It forces this really uncomfortable question. Since when does the goal of, don't upset the family apple cart or preserving a living situation that developed after a crime, when does that override the fundamental principle of justice, especially for a crime against a child?
Right.
It feels totally misaligned with what we think justice is supposed to be about. It's kind of like saying, well, yeah, the thief stole all your stuff, but look, you've rearranged your house now and kind of gotten used to living without it, so he can just keep the loot.
Or, yeah, an even more extreme analogy people have used, like a bank robber marries the bank manager after the heist.
Yeah.
And the court says, well, okay, they're running the bank together now quite nicely, so sending him to jail would really destabilize their joint operation. No prison time needed. It just doesn't square with accountability, does it?
Not at all.
And this is where the criticism gets really sharp.
Yeah.
This ruling, by putting so much weight on the post-crime family structure, it risks dangerously confusing a situation born out of trauma, maybe necessity, maybe pressure, confusing that with a genuinely healthy, consensual family bond.
Ah, okay.
We have to talk about trauma bonding here. It's a real phenomenon where victims can develop these complex emotional attachments to their abusers, often as a coping mechanism or even a survival strategy. That is not a fairy tale romance.
Right.
And it's certainly not a basis for excusing a horrific crime.
So the risk is the court might have interpreted the victim's dependence, her current situation, as a reason to let the perpetrator off the hook, instead of seeing that dependence as potentially a tragic consequence of the original crime and maybe ongoing trauma.
Precisely. And the message this kind of decision sends out is, well, it's incredibly concerning. It really risks signaling that justice is negotiable, that accountability can be compromised if, down the line, the victim's life becomes entangled with the perpetrators, no matter how that entanglement actually happened.
Yeah.
And think about the whole point of the POCSO Act itself. It wasn't just thrown together. It has really strict provisions, strict penalties for a reason. It's designed to be a strong shield for children. It's meant to ensure perpetrators are held accountable and, maybe just as importantly, to send an absolutely clear, unambiguous message across society.
Yeah.
If you harm a child, there will be serious consequences, period.
But this ruling,
By basically letting a convicted perpetrator avoid prison under these specific circumstances, it seems to drastically weaken that message, doesn't it? It makes the law, which is supposed to be this, roaring tiger protecting kids, feel more like a toothless kitten in practice.
a toothless kitten, yeah, that's a stark image. Let's maybe zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture in the country. Because this specific case, it definitely highlights some broader, really difficult issues. We know, tragically, that child sexual abuse is a huge problem, and the reported cases seem to be on the rise.
They are, unfortunately. The numbers are quite sobering when you look at them. If you take specific states, like Kerala, for instance, the reported cases under POCSO have just jumped dramatically.
How much?
Well, about a decade ago, they were seeing around maybe 1,000 cases a year. By 2023, that number had surged to over 4,600.
Wow, that's a huge increase.
It's massive. And the data also tells us something really critical about who the perpetrators often are and their relationship to the victims, which is relevant here.
Okay, what does that data show?
Well, according to figures like from the National Crime Records Bureau, a really significant chunk of perpetrators, maybe around 58% or so, are young men, often between 18 and 30 years old.
Young men.
Yeah. And perhaps even more critically, especially thinking about this West Bengal case, a very high percentage of victims actually know their abusers. They're often family members, neighbors, teachers, people within their immediate social circle. And that obviously adds immense layers of complexity to these cases, both legally and emotionally, for the victim and their family.
So the complexity is definitely real. The victims often know the abuser, the perpetrators are often young. But you're saying that complexity shouldn't somehow become a shield against accountability.
Absolutely not. While the realities on the ground are complex and often heartbreaking, the fundamental job of the justice system has to be navigating that complexity to ensure justice is served and the vulnerable are protected. Not using the entanglement as a reason to excuse the original crime.
Right.
And there's another critical factor here we haven't really touched on much: the immense societal pressure victims and their families often face, especially maybe outside of the big cities.
What kind of pressure?
Well, there's often this strong cultural pressure, sometimes framed as needing to save face or avoid social stigma, pressure for victims to settle the matter.
Settle.
And tragically, sometimes settling means marrying the perpetrator. It's seen as a way to contain the shame or preserve the family's honor, however distorted that sounds.
Marrying the perpetrator to settle it, that's deeply disturbing.
It is. And the court's decision here, by prioritizing the existing family situation as reason to avoid punishment, it risks kind of validating or even exacerbating this harmful societal pressure. It could be interpreted as sending a signal that says, justice. Well, maybe it depends. If you've somehow ended up with a marriage certificate tied to your abuser, perhaps you get a different outcome.
It's almost like handing out a get-out-of-jail-free card from Monopoly in a situation that should be about absolute accountability.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually, yeah.
Okay, let's circle back to that powerful tool the court used, Article 142, the power to do complete justice. We talked about its purpose, but how does its application look right here under scrutiny?
Well, the critique of how it was used in this specific case is very strong.
Yeah.
Using a power that's really designed for ensuring equitable, complete justice. Using that to essentially let a convicted individual avoid the real consequences of a very serious crime,
Yeah.
based on what many people see as, frankly, risky sentimentality around a relationship that formed after the crime. It's deeply concerning. It really forces us to ask, whose justice is actually being prioritized here?
Right.
Is it truly the victim's justice, which surely has to involve accountability for the profound harm done to her? Or is the court maybe inadvertently prioritizing the perceived stability of a situation that was actually born out of that harm?
It feels a bit like applying a nice fresh coat of paint to a bridge that's structurally unsound underneath. It might look okay from a distance, might appear stable for a moment, but it's still fundamentally broken and unsafe to cross. Using Article 142 this way feels like it's maybe creating a facade of justice rather than ensuring its real substance.
That's a really powerful way to put it. And throughout all this legal argument, we have to constantly remember the victim. She was a child when this horrific crime occurred.
Just 14.
Her life was irrevocably altered by that violence. Her situation in 2025, a young mother, bound to her abuser through marriage and a child, that situation is a direct, devastating consequence of the original criminal act.
And that brings up such a crucial question about her voice in all of this. The court's reasoning seems to hinge on this assumption that she would be the worst sufferer if he were jailed, presumably because she's now dependent on him.
Right, the economic dependence, maybe social dependence.
But was her voice truly heard in this decision-making process? Were her actual wishes, her long-term safety, her agency as a person, were those genuinely prioritized over the legal arguments or the external pressures of society, or even just the perceived need to maintain this family unit however it came to be?
Exactly. And that reality of trauma bonding we talked about is so critical here. It's complex, it's insidious, and it absolutely has to be understood as something completely distinct from genuine consent or a freely chosen healthy family environment.
Yeah.
The court's fundamental role isn't to act as, well, as a matchmaker, or to somehow validate potentially harmful dependencies that arose from a crime. Its job is to uphold the law, ensure justice is served, and critically protect victims, especially children.
And then there's the child caught right in the middle of this. The victim is the mother of her abuser's child. That child is now part of this incredibly tangled, painful reality. What kind of message does it send to that child growing up when the very act that led to their existence in these awful circumstances, their father's crime against their mother when she was a child herself, is seemingly overlooked or excused because of the context of the family he has since created with her?
It suggests justice is pliable, malleable, something you can kind of pick and choose from based on convenience or circumstance, maybe.
It makes justice seem less like a firm principle and more like that buffet you mentioned earlier. You just take the bits you want and leave the rest behind.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, as you might guess, when news of this ruling broke, the public reaction was, well, it was intense.
Oh, absolutely. Predictably intense. There was widespread disbelief,
Yeah.
a lot of anger, frustration, and also quite a bit of very pointed sarcasm, especially online and on social media.
What kind of things were people saying?
Oh, the online reaction was swift and Pretty brutal, actually.
Mm.
You saw comments ranging from just outright condemnation, people calling it a slap in the face,
Yeah.
to child protection laws and efforts,
Yeah.
to some incredibly dark humor. People were sarcastically suggesting that, well, maybe criminals should just propose marriage to their victims immediately as a foolproof defense strategy.
Oof.
Yeah. One comment I saw quipped something like, so if I rob a bank, can I just open a joint account with the teller afterwards and we just call it even? That level of sarcastic public reaction, while it's sharp, it really underscores the public's deep-seated expectation, doesn't it?
Mm. That justice means.
That justice means accountability, especially for serious crimes like this.
And that public outrage is important, right? It's not just noise. It signals that people expect more from their justice system.
Definitely.
When the court appears to prioritize a perpetrator's role within a post-crime family setup over the severity of the original crime and the protection of the victim, well, it risks alienating the public. It erodes trust in the very system that's supposed to protect them.
And that's particularly dangerous in a country where we know sexual violence is already significantly underreported. Victims and their families need to believe, absolutely need to believe, that the system will deliver justice if they take the incredibly brave step of coming forward.
That trust is crucial.
It is. Now, it's probably worth acknowledging, India isn't entirely unique in grappling with these incredibly complex cases involving sexual violence, especially where victims and perpetrators become entangled after the fact. This is a challenge that legal systems face all around the world. Researchers globally study why these crimes happen, often finding roots in power dynamics, control imbalances, much more than just purely sexual desire.
Yeah.
And the fact that victims often know their abusers, that's a global phenomenon too, and it complicates legal outcomes everywhere.
But acknowledging that global complexity shouldn't mean we accept a lower standard of justice here.
Precisely. That's the key point.
Yeah.
While the issue has global dimensions, that shouldn't become an excuse for what some people see as a subpar standard or a ruling that potentially undermines the whole purpose of a law like POCSO. We've seen massive public outcry in other complex cases in India, too. Think about the reaction to the outcomes of the Bilkis Bano case. That shows there's a very strong public expectation for real accountability. India should surely aspire to lead by example in upholding justice and rigorously protecting its most vulnerable citizens.
Lead by example. Okay, so given all of this specific case, the really controversial ruling, the broader societal context, where do we go from here? What are some potential pathways forward that kind of emerge from this whole discussion?
Well, several critical steps seem pretty clear based on the criticisms and analysis. First, and maybe most fundamentally, the system really needs to stop viewing victims primarily as characters in some kind of unfolding family drama.
Right.
Their safety, their agency, their actual well-being must be the absolute priority, irrespective of their marital status or their post-crime relationship, however complicated, with the perpetrator.
Focus on the victim first.
Okay.
What else?
Second, and this is huge, there needs to be significant, sustained investment in really robust support systems for victims.
Like what?
We're talking safe shelters, easily accessible counseling and long-term therapy, and really crucial financial aid and support. This is vital if we want to reduce victims' dependence on their abusers and actually empower them to make choices about their own lives, including pursuing justice, without fearing complete destitution.
Makes sense.
We've seen some positive results from initiatives like those in Kerala that try to empower children through school programs to recognize and report abuse. We need to scale those kinds of things up massively and build truly comprehensive support networks around victims.
Got it. Support systems.
Third, there absolutely needs to be a serious, probably public, re-examination of how Article 142 is being applied, particularly in serious criminal cases like this. While it's intended for complete justice, its use really shouldn't undermine the deterrent effect and the core accountability mechanisms of laws like POCSO.
So it shouldn't be a loophole.
Exactly. It cannot become a kind of get-out-of-jail card for individuals convicted of heinous crimes simply because circumstances have evolved, often tragically, after the crime. Justice is also about setting strong, consistent precedents for society, not just navigating the immediate complexities of one admittedly difficult situation.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, fourth, we also need to address the deeper root causes of this violence through real prevention efforts. India's spending on mental health and related social services, well, it's alarmingly low.
How low?
Like a tiny fraction of a percent of GDP compared to much higher percentages, like maybe 5% or more, in many developed countries. We need far, far more resources directed towards tackling poverty, inequality, and especially the deeply ingrained patriarchal mindsets that often fuel violence against women and children.
Address the roots. Makes sense.
And maybe finally, fifth, there's just a fundamental need for a societal shift, particularly in how young men are educated and socialized, teaching them that true power and strength lie in building a safe, equitable, and just society for everyone, rather than in asserting dominance or harming others.
A big cultural shift needed there, too.
Definitely. So this Supreme Court ruling, as controversial as it is, it really serves as a powerful wake-up call, doesn't it?
It seems so.
It exposes this very real tension, this conflict that can arise when the pursuit of legal justice bumps up hard against sentimentality or societal pressures,
Right.
or maybe a narrow interpretation of family values that ends up prioritizing form over fundamental rights and safety.
Yeah, it really drives home that crucial point we keep circling back to. Justice isn't or shouldn't be some customizable buffet where you get to pick and choose the parts you like or find convenient based on how things look right now.
Hmm.
It is, or it absolutely should be, a foundational commitment. A commitment to protecting the vulnerable, ensuring unequivocal accountability for those who commit serious crimes, and sending a crystal clear message that certain lines just cannot be crossed without consequence.
Exactly. And maybe let's leave you, the listener, with this thought to really chew on.
Mhm.
Calling a perpetrator family, especially in a situation that was born directly out of violence and coercion, that doesn't somehow magically erase the crime that was committed.
Yeah.
What it risks doing is burying the truth of that crime and maybe the ongoing trauma it caused under layers of sentimentality and just a superficial appearance of social stability. The court's role, surely, in these critical cases, is to uphold the law and ensure justice is served, not to act as some kind of reluctant validator of circumstances born from violation or, dare I say, play matchmaker for the perceived convenience of the moment.
So the final question really is, what message does it truly send? Not just to perpetrators, but maybe more importantly, to potential victims and to society as a whole, when individuals convicted of such incredibly serious crimes can potentially leverage their post-crime circumstances, redefine themselves as family men, and essentially avoid the fundamental accountability that the law demands.
Yeah.
We absolutely need a justice system that doesn't compromise its core purpose, which has
Yeah.
to be protecting children and punishing those who harm them simply for the sake of convenience, or bowing to societal pressure, or propping up a fragile and potentially deeply harmful perceived stability. Definitely something for all of us to continue thinking about.